To disobey orders during the Second World War was something which could have dire consequences. Inside of the German army, there was zero tolerance taken towards deserters or those who failed to carry out a command. It was shameful and usually ended in execution. There were in 1944 a number of members of the armed forces who were involved in plots to bring down the Third Reich's government and the dictator, and with this thousands of people were shot in the aftermath of the July 20th bombing of the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's eastern headquarters. But one man who was locked up inside of a military prison for failing to carry out an order was General Hans Graf von Sponeck. He had been rotting within the Wehrmacht's prison for a number of years, and eventually it was the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who made the decision in retribution for the plot against Hitler's life to have von Sponeck dealt with once and for all. In this video we look at his life, military career, and the execution of General Hans Graf von Sponeck. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Hans Graf von Sponeck was born in February 1888 within Dusseldorf, and like many young boys of the late 19th century, he dreamed of a career inside the armed forces. He was given a military education, and in 1908 was commissioned into the German army as an officer. A couple of years later he married and had children, but when the First World War broke out, he served as a general staff officer. He served on the Western Front, but was wounded 3 times, but at the end of the conflict he was promoted to the rank of captain, and was decorated with both Orders of the Iron Cross with oak leaves. Now after the war, the army and military of Germany was limited by the Treaty of Versailles, imposed upon them by their enemies, and with this 100,000 soldiers were allowed to remain in the army. Von Sponeck stayed in the army and continued to rise through the ranks, being promoted to colonel. In the 1930s, with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, Sponeck remained within the armed forces, and Hitler relied on experienced First World War soldiers to train and command the younger generation of soldiers who would fight in the next global conflict, which he of course would cause. Sponeck commanded Infantry Regiment 48 and then transferred to the Luftwaffe to train and aid in preparations for paratroop soldiers. These Fallschirmjägers would later become some of the most feared and dangerous forces the Germans deployed during World War II. He was a competent military leader, but was not liked by Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, and future number 2 to Hitler. Göring chastised von Sponeck a number of times, but nonetheless he became the commander of the 22nd Infantry Division with the 42nd Army Corps, and trained airborne infantry. During the early years of the war he remained training soldiers, but then Hans Graf von Sponeck was thrust into the conflict. He was in February 1940 promoted to the rank of general, and months later the German airborne assault began, with Sponeck leading German soldiers into the failed battle for The Hague. He almost fell into the hands of his enemies, and was wounded, but was then awarded the prestigious Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross by Hitler himself. As the military hierarchy were planning to put into place Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Sponeck was given charge of the 22nd Infantry and was part of Army Group South. They were to attack towards Crimea, and 2 days before the invasion began, his staff gave orders that any Jewish Red Army prisoner should be separated from regular Soviet prisoners, indicating that they were probably to be shot and executed on the spot. Months later he had his forces working close with the security police and the SD, rounding up and identifying Jewish civilians in lands which had been taken. These people were then taken to the edge of settlements, where they were forced to dig their own graves, and they were then shot by the forces of the Einsatzgruppe D. Around 2,000 Jewish men, women and children in the city of Melitopol were executed, with Hans Graf von Sponeck's forces aiding in this. He would later admit that he had an active part in the massacre of persecuted people during the invasion of the Soviet Union. However, he was a man who suffered with his health, and General von Sponeck had sciatica and stomach issues, which actually forced him to leave his division on the 14th of October 1941. When he came back in December, he was given command of another force, who continued to murder and slaughter Jewish people. On the 10th of December 1941, von Sponeck ordered that all Jewish people found inside of his area of command were to be treated as partisans or resistance forces, and they were to be made slaves. He said also that those Red Army soldiers who were captured were to be executed immediately. One historian claimed about him that he had the moral courage to refuse an order from Hitler to stand his ground when his troops were threatened with destruction, and he was court-martialed and later killed by the Nazis for it. At the same time, he did not refuse to carry out the criminal commissar order, which gave cover for what became a genocidal war against Bolshevism in the Soviet Union. While von Sponeck was not a Nazi in the technical sense, and was himself critical of some aspects of the regime, his orders and the actions of his troops leave no doubt that he had internalized anti-Semitic racism. Sponeck shows that it was not necessary to be an ideological-driven Nazi to carry out the Nazi regime's policy of mass murder. On the 26th of December 1941, the Red Army advanced towards his forces, and the German 11th Army became encircled. The 46th Division was the only division able to block the advances, but von Sponeck chose to withdraw his division to avoid being caught, and he disobeyed orders direct from the Führer Hitler to hold his ground. He did two things wrong. He disobeyed commands, and he retreated. Now, because of this, he was arrested and seized, and on the 23rd of January 1942, inside of Germany, he was tried in front of Hermann Göring. Göring was furious with him, and von Sponeck tried to maintain that he acted against orders to preserve his division being smashed to pieces by the Soviets. He was found guilty of military disobedience and in defying a superior order, and was sentenced to death. But Hitler later intervened and commuted the death sentence to 7 years in prison. At this time, Sponeck probably was relieved, as he knew he would probably sit out the rest of the war in prison, and then be a free man. He remained inside of Germersheim military prison, a facility established to hold and incarcerate those members of the Wehrmacht and armed forces who were being locked up for military offences. But whilst he was in prison, a deep-rooted conspiracy was being planned and plotted within the armed forces. The Stauffenberg plot was the bombing of Hitler's Wolf's Lair, and the conference room whilst Hitler was giving a military briefing on the 20th of July 1944. The bomb planted by Klaus von Stauffenberg was planned to kill Hitler, and then a coup codenamed Operation Valkyrie was put into place to bring down the government and establish a military command and rule over Germany. Now this ultimately failed, and thousands of people were rounded up and were executed because of this, and the reprisals for the plot were far-reaching and ruthless. General von Sponeck, whilst in prison, was informed that he was to be executed. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, ordered directly the former general's execution, even though he had no role with or contact with the conspiracy at all. On the 23rd of July 1944, within the confines of the military prison, Hans Graf von Sponeck was led out to a firing range where he was to be executed. There had been many who had been executed on the firing range for military offences before. He was led out to a stake against an embankment and was then secured to it. Opposite him filed out a firing squad made up of a number of members of the army. The man in charge gave the command for the soldiers to raise their rifles, and they did, and then the order to fire was given, and instantly bullets were shot through General von Sponeck, and he then slumped over. After his execution, his body was placed inside of a coffin, and he was then buried within the soldiers' cemetery in the Palatinate forest. Now, the execution of Hans Graf von Sponeck is a very controversial one. In the past decade, there have actually been calls to name monuments and even an Air Force base after him, but let's remember that during the Second World War, Sponeck carried out and was involved in a number of war crimes which led to the execution of many thousands of innocent people, slaughtered in the name of the Nazi race laws. He was a general shot for disobeying orders, but was someone who was more than happy to carry out the policies of the Nazis with regards to exterminating innocents. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.